Hi, everyone. I'm Malta Mücel, and today we have Onurcan Yılmaz here with us to give his talk on reflective foundations of human morality. But before I introduce him, I want to remind people to please make sure that you put your country that you're participating from in the chat. We collect all this information, and then we can ask SPSP to continue their support because we want to prove that this is indeed an international event and people are participating from different parts of the world. And I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Onurcan Yılmaz to speak with us today. Dr. Yılmaz is an associate professor of psychology at Kadir Has University in Istanbul, Turkey. His research mainly focuses on dual process accounts of moral judgment and behavior. He has published in leading academic journals such as Nature Human Behavior, Cognition, Evolution and Human Behavior, Current Opinion in Psychology, and Journal of Experimental Social Psychology. He's also currently a consulting editor for the Journal of Judgment and Decision Making. We're very excited to have him here today, so please join me in welcoming him as he presents Reflective Foundations of Human Morality. And just as a note, please keep the questions until the end, and we'll have a Q&A session where you can use the raise hand button to ask your questions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the introduction. Hi, everyone, and greetings from Istanbul. And first of all, thank you for inviting and hosting me here. And this is a fantastic initiative. And special thanks to Jim and Meltem for bringing us together. And of course, I am so glad to be here. Today, I will give you a presentation on moral decision making. More specifically, the dual process accounts of moral judgment and behavior. But instead of presenting a single study findings or single article, I will try to describe my personal journey related to this literature in conjunction with the open science discussions. By the way, I will only mention the experimental findings today in contrast to my abstract and leave the correlational findings aside. In doing so, I will talk about different topics related to morality, different aspects of morality, such as religious belief, ideological orientation, moral judgments and moral behavior, such as generosity, cooperation. And when I talk moral judgment, actually I am referring to, for this presentation, normative ethics and more specifically, moral foundations theory that I think everyone knows well. And I will not mention moralities cooperation theory, for example, or the utilitarianism and deontology distinction. I left them aside as well for this presentation. And I will present how my work has shifted in conjunction with the open science movement. So this is the topic of my presentation. And I will first briefly talk about the work I conducted before and after the open science movement revolution, and try to explain the problems I faced and how I tried to eliminate these problems. And most of them were related to validity issues. And lastly, I will describe in more detail two of my recent projects in more detail, and I will conclude my presentation by discussing that most of the replication crisis may be, in part, coming from some measurement validity crisis, at least for the field I will discuss today. So as a researcher, I am living in Turkey, and as a researcher living in a non-weird country and a predominantly Muslim country, I would like to start with some background information. So Turkey made its transition to secularism almost 100 years ago, but religious institutions are still strong in Turkey. And actually Turkey's founding philosophy in this transition was to internalize Western secular values. But due to religious characteristics of the population in Turkey, it never became an internalized worldview for at least 50% of the population. And for 20 years, Turkey has been witnessing a very similar bi-party polarization as in the United States. And in contrast to the popular opinion about the power of Erdogan as the president, the highest vote he received to date was only 52%. So one side is anti-Erdogan secularists, and the other side is the Erdogan supporters, nearly divided as 50-50. So as a master first year student in 2012, I was paying attention to the discourses of the members of these two groups. And although, of course, both sides were being intuitive on many issues and were actually revealing their own intuitions, one side intuitively held beliefs were about pro-science, reason, pro-vaccination, climate change, evolution, while the others intuitively held beliefs were about nationalism, anti-evolution, emotion, anti-science, or supernatural explanations of physical events. And one side, in fact sees the supernatural explanations as literary ploys, while others literally believe them. So the gap is very deep. And while I was contemplating on these issues about what is the origin of this polarization, an article was published in Science magazine by Gervais and Lorenzen in 2012. And seemingly this article eliminated many questions in my mind as a first-year master's student and who has just started learning how to do research in psychological science. And the theoretical model in this article, the so-called dual process model, actually claims that we have two different processes in our minds, type 1 and type 2. One of them is intuitive, automatic, the other one is the reflective, analytic, etc., etc. And these supernatural beliefs and related beliefs have been taught to be based on relatively more intuitive processes, because these beliefs rely on automatic assumptions acquired during the socialization process. So there is an automatic process here involved here, and according to this logic, you don't need to spend any cognitive effort to be religious in a predominantly religious country. So in contrast, you need to spend some cognitive energy, cognitive effort to become irreligious, because being an irreligious in a religious society actually necessitates questioning and the existing norms in the society. So this model has a clear expectation regarding the influence of intuitive thinking on religious belief. Those who are more likely to engage in reflective thinking, analytic thinking, or who were primed with analytic thinking are also more likely to check and correct initial intuitive conclusions, a process involving religious beliefs as well, and which in turn leads people to suspect religious doctrines common in the society. So this is the clear prediction of the dual process model in the domain of religiosity. And in the original study by Gervais and Aran Lorenzayan, the average religious belief scores of those in the analytic primate group significantly decreased compared to a control condition. So this same result was obtained in 4 different experiments, and the finding was published in Science, one of the best journals in science, with Nature, of course. So this was an incredibly impressive piece of evidence for a student who was in the first year of his master's degree in Istanbul. Okay. And then, the same year, another independent laboratory, David Rand, Joshua Green, and Amita Shenhao, the lab, reached the same conclusion using a different method. And as far as I know, these findings occur without being aware of the existence of the original findings. So they are independent as far as I know. So the authors used a thought priming technique. They used another priming technique, and those directed to thinking intuitively reported higher belief in God in line with the Gervais and Lorenzayan findings. So in accordance with the zeitgeist, so zeitgeist is ready to have such a findings, according to me. 2 separate influential labs and independent of each other asked the same question and reached the same conclusion using different methods, like a hard science. So like how Darwin and Wallace came up with the idea of natural selection at the same time, independent from each other. So this situation really attracted me at that time, and I thought it was very exciting. It would be very exciting to start my career with the replication of this work. And this first scientific work I conducted was the replication of Gervais and Lorenzen study 4, and all of my co-authors were actually my classmates. This was a term project assignment for the Advanced Research Methods course we took at Boğaziçi University, Istanbul. And because for me, these findings were very solid, and it was because it was found by 2 independent laboratories and published in one of the best journals in science. The other one was published in Journal of Experimental General. So I was very sure about the robustness of the effect, and we directly adopted the same methods and activated analytic thinking using the scramble sentence task, which were designed to implicitly activate analytic thinking. And while conducting this study, in addition to the original experiment, we had a chance to measure baseline religiosity of the participants 3 weeks before the experiment. So this was a pre and post test part, not the soul between subjects design. And we bring them into laboratory by dividing them into low, medium, and high religiosity. And when we controlled for baseline religiosity in the experiment, we found the effect of analytic thinking. But when we didn't control for baseline religiosity, there was no effect of analytic thinking. And this was actually kind of shock for me because I thought, how can an effect like this look so solid? The effect that looks so solid replicate so hard. So this is one of the shock I faced. So I must have done something wrong. So this was the first idea that came to my mind. But in second study, we used the same manipulation again on another outcome measure, prejudice, but analytic thought manipulation had no reliable effect again. And then later it turned out that the reason I couldn't find any effect here, any reliable effect here, wasn't because I made a mistake or I lacked the necessary expertise in conducting priming research, because afterwards a lot of different laboratories tried to replicate the same findings but failed to find any effect. And 2 of these null findings were actually both pre-registered and high-powered experiments. Then we continued to test the effectiveness of different methods used to activate analytic thinking for a while, because we need a method, a reliable method to activate analytic and intuitive thinking in our research. And after several failures to activate analytic thinking, fortunately, we had a chance to publish these null findings in that time, at the beginning of the open science revolution, thanks to journals such as PLOS ONE and Judgment and Decision Making. And a very clear picture emerged in my mind: the analytic thought manipulation, which are often used in the literature, simply don't work. So the problem doesn't seem to be related to running the experiments in another language, because all of our subjects are Turkish native speaker for that time. But similar findings emerge in later high-powered studies conducted in English language as well, including our own work, İşler et al. And so we went to see whether there is another promising method for activating reflection and intuition in another literature. And for that goal in my mind, finding a strong analytic thinking manipulation, I started to make a literature review in political psychology, a related field, and I found seemingly another robust finding published in 2012 again, because it was consistently found in 3 different experiments, in 3 different between subjects experiments, that intuitive thinking promotes political conservatism. And those who are in the intuition condition reported higher conservatism, higher levels of conservatism compared to control condition. But these findings has also serious methodological flaws, such as sample size, low sample size. The maximum sample size in each between subjects experiment was 39. So including both experimental and control condition. So this is very low. And we also failed to replicate these findings in 2 different experiments later, one of which was high-powered and pre-registered. So while I was thinking about what to do next, in terms of developing or in terms of using an analytic thinking manipulation, because we were not able to activate analytic thinking with standard measures commonly used in the literature. So we thought, let's develop a new and a powerful method to activate reflection in experiments. So instead of priming analytic thinking, now we gave a 10 minutes analytic thought training, to participants. And in the analytic thought training condition, the participants were asked to solve standard analytic thinking tasks. And we gave standard CRT, cognitive reflection test, and Bayes rate conflict problems. And at the end of each question, we provided the true answer with the explanations like feedback. And then after providing the explanation, we let them solve similar problems in order to understand whether they understood the logic or not. And the goal was to make participants think, at least temporarily, in an analytic thinking style. And in the control condition, the participants were again asked to solve standard CRT and Bayes rate question, but without any explanations or feedback. This method we developed really worked well, and it was highly effective in laboratory experiments and sometimes effective in online experiments, and probably because 10 minutes training in online setting is perceived as too long for an average Turkish participant who are not professional subjects like Turkers, of course. So what happened next? When we run these experiments, it was 2015, and online studies started to become widespread in those years in our field. And in laboratory, I collected data one by one in isolated cubicles for one semester, and the number I could reach was 200 as a maximum per semester. So this was not suitable. This was not sustainable anymore with the increase trends in online studies and online data collection, because most states or in Europe started collecting large amounts of data from MTurk in only one day, by the way. So something must change. I cannot live as if I am living in the 1920s Germany. So then we tested the applicability of this 10 minutes training to an online setting, but failed to find a reliable and consistent effect. It sometimes worked, sometimes failed. And here's a problem emerged again. In online experiments, what can I use as a reliable reflection and intuition manipulation? And for that goal in my mind, I started making a literature review again. And I realized that from the very beginning of psychological science, one robust method has already existed and is often very used, and especially in the cooperation literature, by the way, and it is the time limit manipulation, the so-called time pressure versus time delay. And we generally employed 5 or 10 seconds time pressure to induce intuition and 20 seconds time delay to allow for reflection with prompts to think either intuitively or reflectively. And we also incentivize compliance with time limits, with bonus payments, etc. And then I wanted to go back and test the effects I have previously found, whether it can be replicated with this robust method. And first, I went back to the cognitive science of religion literature again, that starts at the beginning, and I tested whether activating intuition or reflection influences belief in God. And we conducted 2 pre-registered experiments with more than 1,600 participants and found the opposite of what Gervais, Lorenzen, and Chanel et al. Found. In the first experiment, we found that time delay increased religious belief, and in a pre-registered follow-up experiment, in the second experiment, we used the so-called two-response paradigm. So within subjects version of the time pressure and time delay, two-response paradigm. And the participants were first asked to make their decisions under time pressure to activate intuition, and then they were given a chance to revise their decision under time delay to allow for reflection. And the results were in line with experiment 1, and reflection increased belief in God seemingly. But additional exploratory analyses show that the overall change in the mean religious belief tended towards the middle of the scale, so not sure, for both believers and non-believers. So which we call as the reflective religious doubt hypothesis. So I mean, reflection seems to increase self-questioning about one's intuitively held belief about religion instead of increasing religious belief overall. But so by using a more powerful manipulation technique and applying to the topic which we conducted before Open Science Revolution, we were able to achieve a significant effect, even though something surprising came out, which was in contrast to our initial hypothesis, our pre-registered hypothesis. We didn't hypothesize this finding. But in the second experiment, we hypothesized this finding because the first experiment, we found some exploratory evidence and tried to confirm in the second experiment. So these findings actually made the literature more complex, by the way, rather than clarifying it, but it was very useful in generating a novel hypothesis. So using the time limit method, I decided to go back again to those findings that interest me in the past. And this time we attempted to replicate Wright and Barrett's famous findings published in 2011 as a flash report in JSP, arguing that conservatives devalue group binding foundations when thinking intuitively and become more liberal. And these findings was very influential for me as well, because it claimed that we are all liberal at heart and the essence of morality is comprised of care and fairness. So, but after looking at the article in more detail, actually there were several limitations of the original effects, such as merging of the two experimental conditions or not reporting the necessary interaction statistics for their focal analyses in hypothesis testing. So it was based on a single and a low-powered experiment. So it was before Open Science Revolution, shortly. So because we now have a reliable method to induce intuition, so that is the time pressure, we attempted to conceptually replicate these findings and whether to understand intuition influences moral foundations. And in the first experiment, participants completed each item in 3 seconds time pressure and this is the experimental condition, or without any time limits as control condition. And despite successful manipulation checks of time limits, we found no main effect of time pressure and interaction with the political orientation. And in the second experiment, we thought that maybe the familiarity of the MFQ, Moral Foundation Questionnaire items, prevented us to find a reliable effect of our manipulation, because it is very difficult to change stable opinions with an experimental manipulation. So in the second experiment, we decided to add the Moral Foundation's vignettes in addition to MFQ as a between subject factor, not within subject factor, because we wanted to make a strong test of this hypothesis. And our sample size in both experiments were very large, more than 3,000 participants we recruited. And the results showed strong evidence against an effect of intuitive thinking on moral foundations, including an internal Bayesian meta-analysis we conducted. So I guess you are all aware of the reliability and validity problem of Moral Foundations questionnaire. It's a questionnaire that has poor fit values in terms of standard fit indexes, commonly used in the literature, in the psychometric literature. And it is the case in almost every country, even including the original work of Graham et al. It has poor fit values. So this is a very interesting phenomenon, I think, for social psychology, because it is one of the most common questionnaire in the literature. So we are talking about a poor measure cross-culturally. So while keeping this in my mind, to understand this failure of replication, this time I didn't put the blame on manipulation's shoulder, the technique's shoulder. So this time I blamed my DV, dependent variable, MFQ. So this time I decided to change my outcome measure instead of manipulation. And more specifically, I started to study actual behavior instead of moral judgments after these failures of replication. It is actually very interesting, by the way, that although behavior is the subject matter of psychology, actual behavior is rarely used as dependent variables. especially in the last decade. So intention, or instead of this, intention or attitude measures or attitude task or hypothetical sacrificial moral dilemmas are often used to measure DV. I also use those DVs in my past research as well. So this approach is highly criticized in behavioral economics. And there are some findings supporting the view that intentions don't correlate well with actual behavior, including the domain of morality. So especially in the political psychology literature, almost all past research relied on attitude or intention measures, except a few exceptions. So liberals, in terms of these attitude measures, liberals are taught to be more egalitarian and have less group bias than conservatives in this attitude measure. But there is also a long-standing tradition, empirical tradition, using actual behavior, indicating that people cooperate more with their in-groups. So liberals are not immune to this strong human nature of tribalism. So one prediction that can be inferred from this long-standing empirical tradition is, when we look at the actual behavior, in-group favoritism should not be peculiar to conservatives. So it can be seen in both ideologies in nearly equal levels, because it is human nature. And as I said, liberals should not be immune to these tribalistic tendencies if they are not from Venus, of course. So I think it is an ever-changing phenomenon as well, depending on who is in charge in the government. So it is an interactive process. It is not a stable process. It's not a disposition. So we wanted to test this ideological symmetry versus asymmetry distinction or arguments by using actual behavior. And we also wanted to test whether intuition promotes this group bias in actual behavior and impedes fairness or equal split in sharing behavior. So we conducted two different experiments, and in the first one, equal numbers of conservatives and liberals were recruited to the study based on independently and previously provided self-reports as either liberal or conservative. And participants were paired in a one-shot dictator game. We use dictator game as DV. And in the dictator game, either with an ideological in or out group, they played the game. And the game was played either under 5-second time pressure and 20 seconds time delay. And to measure sharing behavior, we use the standard economic task of dictator game, where each active participants decides how much of an endowment to share with a passive other. And we didn't use any deception in experiments. Actually, we found no evidence for the effect of time pressure and group identity, so that supporting ideological symmetry view. However, we found nearly identical group bias among liberals and conservatives, regardless of the cognitive manipulation they were assigned to. So it supports the ideological symmetry view. So it is actually in line with the other accumulated evidence using actual behavior in behavioral sciences that people share more with their in-groups and liberal are not less biased when measured with actual behaviors. But in study 2, as a follow-up, we asked 2 additional questions. In which situation ideological asymmetry can occur, and by using which types of manipulation we can identify a reliable effect of intuition and reflection. And we propose that in cases when polarization is high, we can observe an ideological asymmetry. So that's why we conducted a new pre-registered experiment on the day the presidential transition to Biden happened in 20th of January. And in this experiment, active participants completed an allocation task. It's a sharing, it's a measure of sharing behavior. But participants completed an allocation task twice. First under 5 seconds time pressure, and then 20 seconds time delay to induce deliberative decisions. So it is the two response paradigm. And we employed a 2x2 mixed design on group bias, where there are between subjects group membership of either being a liberal Democrat or a conservative Republican, and within subjects time limit manipulations of either 5-second time pressure and 20 seconds time delay. And this is the allocation task, not game. It is a task, allocation task. Each participant was given a lottery ticket here and told that they need to allocate this reward between two randomly selected participants, and one of them was a Democrat and the other one was a Republican, and we fully counterbalanced the order across participants. And we calculated two scores based on the allocation task. The first one is the average group bias, referring to the percentage of the allocation shared with the in-group. And we also calculated a fairness score, where equal split was estimated as the maximum point, and any deviation from the equal split in either direction was closer to 0. Interestingly, the results showed that in the face of high polarization, liberals showed higher group bias and lower fairness than conservatives on actual behavior, in contrast to the previous literature. And at the same time, reflection decreased group bias overall and promoted fairness overall by increasing equal distribution. So the results suggest that when liberals and conservatives make some sharing decisions among their in versus out groups in the times of high polarization, conservatives can be more egalitarian and less biased than liberals. So it is possible, as data suggests. And reflection can mitigate the negative consequences of polarization, maybe by decreasing group bias and increasing fairness concerns on actual behavior for both groups. So this is the first findings. Another recent experimental finding I am going to briefly describe today is about one of the perennial philosophical questions: are we intuitively selfish or cooperative? So there is an extant literature here. I will not go into it very much. So in summary, built on the framework of the dual process model, social heuristics hypothesis argues that pro-social behavior in one-shot anonymous economic games involving social dilemma situations such as public goods game or prisoner's dilemma game reflects intuitively held or intuitively applied heuristics acquired in previous social interactions. So people intuitively show cooperation in these games according to these hypotheses, and supporting it, intuitive thinking had been shown to increase cooperation in economic games involving social dilemma situation. But then the robustness of the phenomenon have been questioned, and various moderating factors have been suggested. And one of these moderating factors was actually the environment, the cooperative environment, the quality of the cooperation, because cooperative heuristics grow stronger, especially in cultural contexts where of routine cooperation, and become weaker in context of routine defection, right? So a likely explanation is these mixed findings can be a background experiences in terms of the pro-social intuition. So we predicted that in an environment where non-pro-social intuition is the norm, people can intuitively be selfish, not cooperative, and can act cooperatively by thinking reflectively. So to test this, we recruited previously self-identified practicing Christians and atheists. It was a pre-selection, and we chose believers and atheists because both representative surveys and experimental research clearly shows that atheists are one of the least liked groups worldwide, and religious people consider atheists as distrustful people simply because they don't believe in a personal God. So cooperation, because cooperation requires a trusting environment, religious people's stereotypes about atheists provides a perfect environment for us to test the social heuristics hypothesis in a potentially low trust context. And this article was recently published in Nature Human Behavior as a registered report, and our hypotheses, statistical plan, and sample size were all pre-registered before any data collection. And this was a high-powered experiment because it was a registered report, and we recruited pre-identified Christians and atheists from the same online data collection platform, Academic Prolific. And we used one-shot prisoner's dilemma game in this experiment to measure cooperation behavior and relying on instruction used in the previous literature. And in this game, a pair of participants individually decides how much of 50 cents we use to keep and how much of it to allocate to their pair in 1 cent increments. And amount allocated to their pair is our measure of cooperation, ranging from 0 to 50. And participants earned double the amount allocated to them and by their pair in addition to any money they kept for themselves in the game. And in order to activate intuition and reflection, we use time delay and time pressure. So prisoner's dilemma game was elicited either under 10-second time pressure or 20 seconds time delay with prompts to be quick or carefully consider your decision. And in order to experimentally manipulate in-group versus out-group distinction, we use a social media profile, and it is ecologically, we wanted to use an ecologically more valid manipulation. That's why we use other identity labels, because it is more similar to real life experiences, such as nationality, age, language, and the online platform membership, and without using any deception, of course. We didn't use any deception. And in the game, practicing Christians played the prisoner's dilemma game in equal probability, either with another practicing Christian, which is the in-group condition, with an atheist, which is the out-group condition, or with someone without identity information, which is the neutral outcome condition. And we found evidence for parochialism, in contrast to some of the earlier findings, based on religious identity, with Christians cooperating more with co-religionists than with atheists, and of course vice versa, and the atheists cooperating more with their in-groups, replicating the long-standing evidence that people cooperate more with their in-groups. So this is very robust. However, we failed to find support for social heuristics hypotheses. Instead, our findings provided evidence for self-control account, predicting that reflection increases cooperation compared to intuition. And when we control for game understanding and the experience, the results remain constant. But in contrast to our initial hypothesis, we failed to find any interaction between time limit and religious identity, because we actually initially questioned in this project whether parochialism can be decreased by policies which promote reflection. But we couldn't find any significant interaction. So while we found no evidence for an intuitive basis of religious group bias, our results suggest maybe nudging reflection can promote cooperation independent of group identity. Okay, everything is going well so far, but our recent pre-registered experiment indicated that time delay method, as we call reflection here, is not actual reflection manipulation, but functions like a control condition. Yeah, said but true. But the effect we found in previous experiments should not be interpreted as reflection decreases group bias and increases fairness and cooperation, but according to these findings, it should be interpreted as intuition increases group bias and decreases fairness and cooperation. And then, after these surprising results, we wanted to replicate this in a more comprehensive methodological experiment, and this time we added intuition manipulations as well, which are frequently used in the literature, in addition to reflection manipulations, of course. So you can see the groups we use in this table, the manipulation techniques we use, and there are more than 1,600 participants, so it was a very high-powered experiment. And the participants were randomly assigned to the reflection, intuition, or control groups. We tried almost all promising techniques in activating intuition and reflection. We use very high load. We use 5-second time pressure, 10-second time pressure, 10 seconds time delay, 20 seconds time delay. We also developed a shorter version of the analytic thought training that we previously adapted in the laboratory online. We are finally successful at developing an online version of this training. And also we developed a shorter version of that online version in this experiment, large-scale experiment. And we also focused on the effects of simply incentivizing the correct answer, the effect of incentivization, which is the monetary incentive condition. And we also tested the effectiveness of emotion priming, which is a very simple but very widely used and discussed in the literature, especially in the cooperation literature. This method has been criticized before as it may elicit some kind of demand effect because it is relying, the instruction is just rely on emotion rather than reason. That's very simple. So we also tested the effectiveness of this highly controversial method. And the results show that the long and short versions of the debiasing technique significantly increase cognitive performance, which are the online version of our previous analytic thought training method. But surprisingly, emotion prime has the strongest effect among intuition manipulations. But fortunately, time pressure has also a decreasing effect on cognitive performance, but time delay has no effect. Neither of the time delay has no effect. And we also employed the two response paradigm in this experiment in order to check whether it is really effective or not. And we modified two different versions with very slight differences, and results indicated that both versions of the two response paradigm is effective. Time delay is not different from the between subjects control condition, whereas the time pressure condition is different than the control condition. So these findings converge with the previous one and clearly indicates that time delay serves as a control condition, not a reflection condition. So I should come back to all of this research again with this information. Okay, finally, as a conclusion, as everybody knows anymore, even non-psychologists, our field has a wide variety of problems. And one of them is the theory crisis, maybe the harsh one. And the lack of an overarching theory really prevents us from having a new or solid predictions. And we have, of course, a related replication crisis. But furthermore, we mostly measure our dependent variables, mostly at the intentional level. So which probably leads to some mixed findings, as I tried to show in this presentation, because there is no variable in psychology other than gender or age that can be measured perfectly reliably. So it might be much more efficient for us to focus on actual behaviors more in the face of this replication crisis. And we have also a weirdness problem. And the problem is, to me, actually, even if we collect data from non-weird cultures, they are often chosen from college students or adults who can speak English. So it is also doubtful how non-weird these people are. And another problem related to this is that most of the correlational studies are based on convenience samples, and representative samples are used very rarely in psychology, not in other social sciences. Behavior economics uses actual behaviors, political scientists uses representative samples, we uses convenience samples based on intentional measures. So, but despite all of these problems, I think the more important problem than this, or a more urgent problem, maybe a better description, more urgent problem, and the problem we can solve immediately is the measurement validity crisis. Because today we are able to run cross-cultural multi-lab experiments, replication studies, and I am also involved in many of them. And if you have joined them, you probably solve the problem in these cross-cultural attempts. While the scales are translated into a different language with a translation and back translation process, they are not validated before using them in the main replication studies. So, although we can assume that basic psychological mechanisms are universal, the materials we hope to activate these universal mechanisms can certainly be influenced by culture. So it is a culturally bounded phenomenon and can have different meanings. So the same material, the same symbol can have different meanings in different cultures. So directly translation the measurement tool in the original study to a new culture without showing the construct validity is definitely a situation I think we should leave as soon as possible, because the hypothesis test without validity checks don't make much sense. When there is no effect, how can we be sure whether it is due to the material's validity problem or if the effect is really superior? So in order to solve the replication crisis, I think the first thing we need to prioritize is the measurement validity issue. So today, I simply tried to show how the internal validity problem of the analytic and intuitive thinking manipulations affected my whole research and how I tried to overcome this problem by allocating more time and more resources to measurement validity studies. So I believe validity can be a priority for all of us in our future research, especially in multi-lab cross-cultural studies. And thank you very much for your listening.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. If you've got questions, if you could raise your hand using the raise hand function, and then we can call on you, and then you can say it verbally. If for any reason you can't say it, you can just type it in the chat and I can read it out. But it's always nicer to hear voices and to have a bit of connection. So please do raise your hands. I mean, I can start off with one question that I had. So it seemed from your work, especially in I think it was the religion project, that you were using the moral foundations one, where you were using the time pressure with these kind of longer descriptors, like the vignettes, the moral dilemmas. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that and whether you think it works as well or is as appropriate a measure as it is for economic games, because at least I was very much brought up with the idea that they're really great for using time pressure manipulations are great for economic games, but that they can be a bit more tricky when you have these kind of longer, more social psych dependent variables. So at least I've never used that approach in my own work, and I've always had to try and use other things. So I'd love to hear a bit more from you about that and how you think time pressure can be used as a good measure across the board.
Yes, this is a good interpretation, and this is one of the limitations we had in our minds when applying these time pressure to the questionnaire items. But there were past examples of doing this, such as Eidelman et al. One of them, their experiment was used this, and although limitations or some potential dangers of using time pressure on questionnaire items, our recent experiments show the effectiveness of using time pressure repeatedly in cognitive manipulation, cognitive reflection tasks. So seemingly there is not any problem, but more important problem is what time pressure does to emotion and intuition differently. So it's an ongoing research. We still don't know what time pressure increases. For example, there is some research supporting the view that time pressure increases social desirability. They applied time pressure to a social desirability questionnaire, and after increasing social desirability, they concluded that it increases social desirability. So my goal is to avoid using time pressure in the near future. I'm trying to develop novel techniques.
Great, thank you. I think our next question is from Nick Bird. So I'm going to allow you to talk. Nick, there you are.
Hi, Onurcan. Great talk and love your research. So I'm interested in this time delay paradigm, but I guess maybe based on what you just said, this question might not be as useful as I was thinking. So I was kind of wondering, you did well to kind of show how the time delay interventions correlate with other outcomes, and I thought that was pretty compelling. And then I found myself wondering, I wonder what's happening during the time delay. So like, is there any measurements that have been done to figure out what's happening during the time delay as opposed to what's happening after the time delay? And the things I'm thinking are like recording people thinking out loud, or like using scripts to record like whether they're off task during the time delay or like doing something else. Because it would be interesting to figure out like which of all of these people who are in the time delay condition are actually reflecting versus like doing something else. Because what if the people who are actually reflecting are actually having even stronger effects or something like that, or maybe there's some other unexpected thing happening during these time delays. So yeah, I just wondered if you could, if you have any ideas or even observations of what's going on during the time delay.
Are you talking about the within subjects comparison of time pressure and time delay, or time delay in general?
Just time delay in general. So if you say like, 20-second time delay, I guess I'm wondering what's happening during those 20 seconds.
Actually, that is the problem of time delay. Nobody knows what people are doing during the time delay. So that's why we suspect that time delay cannot be effective as initially assumed. So our recent experiment, which is very recent experiment, 1 month ago we conducted. So it is in line with our hypothesis. So I share your concerns about the time delay, and it falsifies my own research. So you are right. I don't know what people are doing during the time delay. So seemingly it is like a control condition. So they are doing nothing. They are just waiting and interested in something else in the online studies. Probably because of it, it serves as a control condition. But the effective one is the time pressure condition. So.
Although I guess that is an open question, right? Which maybe is what Nick was getting at, maybe, unless I'm misunderstanding, that it could be acting as a control condition, or it could not be. At least I think I have some preliminary data from before suggesting that you do get some slight differences between a forced deliberation condition versus a control condition where you don't have any information. But then if you just have a control condition, then you end up with a problem that some people will take their time and some people will act quickly, and so it sort of cuts across it. But I do think that would be a really interesting thing to
yes, I remember. Excuse me. I remember your past finding with David Rand deliberation erodes cooperation. So you found evidence in that experiment deliberation differ from control condition in cooperation. But what we showed here is there is no difference between time delay and control on cognitive performance. So maybe time delay activates something different than the reflection. So this can be a follow-up question.
Yeah, thank you. Great, thanks, Nick. So we've got Killian McHugh up next. I'm going to allow you to talk.
Hello. I've just got a very practical question for what advice would you give to somebody looking to manipulate sort of intuitive versus deliberative processes in online studies? I've run cognitive load manipulations, and the dot patterns, they just don't seem to be working for me. So what advice would you give?
We use some codes in Qualtrics, so I can share with you. It was very difficult. It was a harsh process, but we succeed at applying these cognitive load manipulation in an online context. So just let me know with an email, and I can share with you.
Cool. Great, thanks.
You're welcome.
And our last question, I guess, is from Christian Rodriguez, who's put in the Q&A box at the bottom. He's put, regarding the relationship between religiosity and analytic thinking, are there religion-specific differences? Different religions have diverse evaluations of reasoning or scientific thinking. So he was wondering if that could be an interesting mediator, and if you have any work or thoughts about that.
Yes, this is a very good question. It can be theodiversity, as Aran Oranzayan argued, in terms of different religiosity. But when we think of theistic religions, such as Muslim, Islam, and Christianity, we can see some common ground in terms of relies on intuition, because the most common belief in these theistic religions are the belief that morality is founded on a divine authority. So it actually impedes reflective thinking capacities, because responsibility is not yours. You attribute the responsibility of questioning something about morality to a personal God, a higher God. So I think there is a common ground in theistic religions, but I have no idea and I have no experience for other religions, monotheistic religions. So I have some data about different aspects of different kinds of God views, such as Pascal's wager or monotheism, etc., etc. But they are all preliminary, so I have no idea how it occurs. Maybe Joseph Henry can know the answer.
That's really interesting. I imagine it might also differ on the type of religious orientation, or the type of religious person you are, not just which affiliation, but the kind of Batson or Allport's approach to religion. Yeah.
Yes, we had a relevant data for that. We found correlationally that quest religiosity is positively correlated with reflection, whereas intrinsic and extrinsic religiosity were negatively and significantly. So this was an important moderator.
Oh, cool, awesome. Great. Well, we've run out of time for today. Thank you so much, Onurcan, for coming and giving that talk. It was really interesting and clearly very practical. So just two quick announcements and before we go. If you're an early career member that's listening to this, so less than 6 years post PhD or doing your PhD, we're going to have a flash talk of 15-minute talks in the seminar on Monday, May 31st. So if you're interested in presenting your work, just follow the link in the chat and you can put your name down with a title and an abstract. But we'll be seeing everyone in 3 weeks for Dries Boston from the University of Ghent, who's going to talk about some of his work. So that's Monday, the 10th of May, at the same time as whatever this started in your time zone. So thanks again to Onurcan for coming. Thank you all to attending, and we'll see you all in 3 weeks. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks for